Everyone, it's a joy and privilege to be here together, and so alrighty. So we've been in this series where we're going through Genesis 1 through 11, doing kind of philosophic reflections on these stories that comprise together a depiction of what humanity is understood to kind of share, what we all have in common, the stuff we're made of, so to speak. And what I want us to do in this session is kind of pause, step outside the sequence just a little bit, to explore something that surfaced last time. So last time we reached at the end of our time, Genesis 6, 1 through 4, in which you have this really kind of curious, bizarre passage, right? Where the sons of God, which if you kind of take from this the same meaning as you have in other biblical passages, like the beginning of Job and Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32, then these are kind of immortal members of the divine court, okay? That in other contexts end up being called angels, but that's a later thing. Kind of the earlier language is sons of God. And they come down, they take daughters of men, they beget through these women children that become giants, okay? Unusual, right? And so we looked at that, and I gave a very particular reading of what was going on there that I'll mention again in a moment. But what I want us to do today is in later kind of Second Temple Jewish thought, so, around Jesus' era and even for, say, 2-3 centuries before him, there's developments in how this episode is thought of. And in particular, what happens in the tradition, in the literature that passes under the name of Enoch, right? So you have First Enoch in particular. This is understood to be also where you have the origin of the demons, okay? And so what I want us to do today, as kind of a side note, is to kind of dig into like what's going on with demons. Okay, what's that about? And this, although it sounds kind of bizarre, let me just suggest this is still very deeply connected to this kind of overall understanding of what is it that human beings kind of are made of, like how do we function, okay? And I'll try to just speak as clearly as I can on this. I had a teacher years ago that said, if you're going to be wrong, at least be clearly wrong, right? So that's what I'm going to aim at here. I'm going to try to be as absolutely like clear as possible in what I'm thinking. And I may be wrong, but if I can manage to be clearly wrong, then we'll call that a success, okay? All right. So part of what we want to ask in here is kind of within this tradition and then kind of how it connects to human life. What are these things? Demons. What do they do? And I want to place that within this kind of larger picture also of created persons. Like, what's a person? Okay. How are we put together, and how, if I can put it this way, how might we come apart? Because my understanding of what's going on with the demons has to do with how we come apart, so to speak. Okay. All right. So let me go back and just kind of recap this particular reading that I gave of that passage in Genesis 6. Okay. I suggested that in the background of this passage, there might be a concept that comes from the ancient Near East, which is there's this ritual that they called, scholars refer to it as hierosgamos, using a Greek, the Greek terms translate sacred marriage, but in the ancient Near East, there was this way in which there was a kind of a ritual sex that was performed, typically by king who is thought to be embodying a god. Okay, and it was at particular times with special rituals and all of that. And my suggestion is that what's in the deep background of this idea of the sons of God taking daughters of men is something like this. And so what this would mean is that actually you have two human beings, a male and a female, and the male, the king, is thought to, he invokes and in some sense embodies this spiritual being, okay? And in the ritual act of sex, then there's a conception that takes place. Now, part of what we noticed in the flow of Genesis 5 and into 6 is, or into 4, into the beginning of chapter 6, is that this is depicted as the end of a shift that takes place in a line that has this kind of really promising beginning. You have the line of Seth, who discover prayer, right? He names his first child Enoch, and at that time it says people begin to call upon the name of the Lord. They begin to pray. And then we kind of trace this, I won't do it again today, this kind of shock where they realize that death is inevitable. They can't get out of it despite calling on the name of the Lord. And that seems to set up a shift in which they decide to invoke something else. And I think that's what's setting up this passage at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, where it's something like, well, we called on God, He didn't help. Let's see if something else helps and gives us special power, right? And so the result is our children, kind of hybrid of sort with some special strength, and these are the men of name, of kind of reputation and power, right? All right, that was my attempt, summary from last time, to understand Genesis 6 in its own context. But now let me say a little bit about this tradition from Enoch, because it's influential in important ways, okay? And it's even becoming kind of popular to talk about nowadays in the internet spaces. So, but this tradition, with First Enoch being kind of the epicenter of it, chapter 6 through 16 is where you get kind of the important part of this reading. It offers an expanded narrative, okay, of from this chapter 6, 1 through 4. And what it does in this extended narrative is it concludes with talking about the origin of the demons, okay? Very specifically, it sees the demons or the evil spirits as something like the ghosts, the departed spirits from the giants once they're killed, okay? Let me summarize it, and here's the whole thing, okay? So led by a kind of chief angel or watcher, 200 of these angels that are, by the way, the term watcher, it comes from the book of Daniel also, right? And the idea is you've got beings that don't have to sleep, so they're called watchers, right? Right, so these immortals, they're not dependent as we are. They don't drift off after, a long time on spring break, and so they're the watchers, right? They can handle it. But you've got two of them that kind of inexplicably decide to band together and rebel against God, and they're going to come down, and what they're going to do is they're going to take human wives and reproduce and kind of make an offspring on earth. And so you have kind of a chief one by the name of Shemi-Hazah, who kind of leads these 200, and they take an oath, so none of them will back out, that they'll follow through on this. They come down, they descend on Mount Hermon in the north of Israel. And they each take their wife, take a woman, and they have sexual relations, beget offspring. But what's even worse is they talk to them. Then they engage in a bit of pillow talk, and in this, what they do is they reveal kind of heavenly secrets to these women, okay? And so the wives hear about, they're taught sorcery and magic spells, the beginnings of pharmacology. It's the cutting of roots and plants and so forth, but kind of the beginnings of pharmacology. Now, the children that are that are begotten from these deathless beings, they become giants, right? And it may even be implied that some of this kind of special pharmacology and stuff is a part of that, because it emerges in that order in Enoch's story. But these giants then are just horrific. They're violent. Not only are they like killing people all around, but they engage in cannibalism. And they're drinking blood and so forth. It becomes so dark, so violent. Evil spreads enough on the world that the earth starts to cry out. Just before that, you have this other figure, another chief watcher, Asael, who comes down and he teaches men certain things. He teaches them a kind of metallurgy, how to make iron weapons and armor, and the crafts of the jeweler and how to dye fabrics and things like this. Okay, so, and then some others get involved and reveal astrology. Okay, now, in the midst of all the evil going on earth, the earth begins to cry out, and so God sends angels, good angels, to imprison the renegade ones, prepare Noah for the flood, and to kill off the giants. Okay? Now, that brings us to the demon part, okay? So the giants are slain, but in this account, because they're hybrid, right? Their ancestry, they have these kind of deathless heavenly beings, as well as then a human parent. They can't be killed off, they can't be snuffed out completely. And so when the giant is killed, the spirit of that giant continues, but is bound to earth, and it becomes, each of them become evil spirits or demons, right? That continue on earth, kind of creating mischief in all sorts of ways. So let me read just a little bit. So this is from 1 Enoch chapter 15. And I'll go in and out from 8 down through 11. Now the giants were begotten by the spirits and flesh, and they'll call them evil spirits on earth, for their dwelling will be on earth. And it goes on to talk about that a little bit more. And the spirits of the giants, verse 11, this is what they do. I want you to just kind of get a sense of the activity, what they do. They lead astray. They do violence, so they provoke people. They make desolate. They attack and wrestle. And they hurl people onto the earth. They cause illnesses. They eat nothing, but abstain from food, and they're thirsty, and they strike out. These spirits, verse 12, they'll rise up against the sons of men and against the women, for they've come forth from them, and it goes on. Okay. So these departed spirits, they're left on earth, and they provoke hostility between people. They cause different kinds of illnesses. And they kind of generally kind of lead people in to destruction. Right? That's the end of this little bit of the story. Okay, so here's the question: how do we make sense of this? Right? And say one other thing here. I mentioned this last time, but Enoch, although it feels very fantastical, it's not easy to completely dismiss for this reason. It was actually rather important for Jesus' family. Okay, we find his little brother Jude quoting it. It's alluded to in 2 Peter as well. We find Jesus' family making use of this. According to a little testimony that we have in Eusebius, but I think comes from Hegesippus, his family travels with a genealogy, probably the one in Luke, and the Book of Weeks, which is a section from this book of 1 Enoch. And as they come across, as they go from synagogue to synagogue and so forth, as far as their journeys take them, they use this passage in order to explain that Jesus, to show from the genealogy that Jesus is Messiah. Okay? So the use of Enoch in Jesus's family, it's significant. Okay? So I think what I want to say is there's something here that is worth thinking more deeply about, even if the story on the surface kind of strikes us as like, whoa, okay? So let me tell you how I think about this. Two things. First of all, I do believe there are personal beings, agents, intellects that are higher than human beings and lower than God, okay? I think there's such things as this, and I expect that they're working in the world still. I don't think that they're corporeal in this way and have, as it were, the sexual equipment to directly, take somebody in that way. And this is part of why I think that this understanding from the ancient Near East of the sacred marriage ritual is one way of thinking about how this kind of connects, that there's some sense in which these beings to act have to be received and channeled. Okay? And let me just kind of point out, because this is another one of Jesus's family members here in James' letter, right? James, the brother of the Lord. Chapter 1, 13 through 15. Right? Let no one, when he is tempted, say that God is tempting me. All right? For God is not tempted by evil, right? Neither does he tempt anyone, but each one is tempted by his own desires, lusts, when by his own desires he's dragged away and deceived. When lust has borne itself on it, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it comes full grown, produces death. Okay? What you have here, actually, it's interesting. Did you notice that you have the language of kind of, so to speak, rape and reproduction, sexual reproduction here? And the point of it is that it actually happens kind of through desires that are brought in that then kind of take on this life within a person that's death dealing. Okay, that this kind of dynamic within the person, him or herself. Okay, so let me just kind of offer a sense of how we might move from this kind of the surface reading of Enoch to something more like we find in Jesus' brother James, right? As an account of how such beings work, all right? The thing that I want to point out, well, let me say one other thing about kind of a Christian sense of what spirit is. I'll say two things. First, it's actually distinctive in the ancient world that, like, the concept of immaterial spirit, it emerges with Jewish philosophers in Alexandria in particular, and then it's found in Christian texts, okay, and becomes kind of the norm. And so that's something that's different from how you have it in people like Plato and Aristotle and so forth, where spirit is a material thing, and then the Stoics and so forth, right? So that's first thing. Second, so what do we think of when we think of spirit in this kind of Christian sense, kind of Jewish Christian sense? Let me just offer this. It's a definition I lifted from Dallas Willard, but it works. So let me just try this on. I think when we think of a spirit, we think of something like unbodily, personal power. Unbodily, personal power. Okay? That and each of those words is important. Now, by unbodily, we mean it's not kind of just composed of matter. It's not dependent on a body to live, to exist. It can exist separately. But it's personal. Okay? And what I mean by that is that, and we'll talk about this here in a moment, it's composed of things like, thoughts and evaluations and judgments and feelings and so forth, right? All the things that we think of as personal, right? So this is as opposed to, may the force be with you sort of thing, right? But then it's also power. It has a capacity to perform work, to do things in the world, okay? And at some level, you just think about it like this, like what brought you into this room tonight? The laws of physics didn't gust you in the door, right? If you came on, on the bus or something, the laws of physics were very involved in that thing working. But what brought you here were choices, right? And priorities and things like this, right? And so what's personal also makes things happen. There's a power in it, okay? Now, so let's see if we can kind of pull out something that's embedded in this kind of picture in Enoch that I think kind of continues on. It repeats in other contexts in a little bit different way. And so here's what I want to suggest. So this picture of demons as, let me suggest, I'm going to just try this on. The demons are fragments of persons. Okay? A demon is a fragment of a person. And it's a fragment with a complexity of thought and feeling sufficient to have an ongoing life of its own. Something like that. Okay? Now, and I think that picks up something of what's going on in the Enoch thing, where it's this bit left over from these giant beings, right? So it's not a whole person; it's a bit of one, right? And let me kind of zoom out a little bit and think a little bit about what personhood is, or if I can put it this way. I'll just call it created personhood. I don't want to make any kind of dogmatic statement here about uncreated persons. But I think we have in these texts already some sense of what created persons are like, right? And so in Genesis 1, we've already seen that there's something like a kind of a core of personhood that is agency. It's this dominion, this impulse to kind of make things happen. And by that, we image God. Okay? And so there's something like that, but then when you move into succeeding chapters, that gets complexified. There's like different aspects of it, right? And so we saw that in Genesis 2, that it kind of branches into, or it becomes impulses to produce and protect and to communicate, right? Those are different kind of manifestations, complexifications of this impulse to make something happen. And then we saw in chapter 3 kind of further entanglements and diversifications of that. All that to say that there's a kind of a complexity to personhood that we've seen kind of developed here already in this biblical picture. Now, one might say then that created persons, with their complexity, they're composed of evaluations and judgments and thoughts and feelings, intentions, desires, aversions, choices, yieldings, all of that, right? It's the stuff that we experience day by day, right? Now, because of this complexity, it's possible for persons to exist on, as it were, on continuums, in which one might be relatively more integrated or relatively disintegrated. Does that make sense? More or less kind of put together and cohesive, or kind of breaking apart, right? And likewise, there could be kind of degrees of coherence, incoherence within created persons, okay? If that's the case, then it doesn't seem like a huge stretch to say that a created person could break apart, could, as it were, fragment in some important sense. Okay? Now, in the story that we got in 1 Enoch, we saw the evil giants killed, and then part of that giant, the spiritual fragment, kind of continuing on and working mischief. I'll point out that actually there's a Gentile pagan version of that that you get in certain strands of Greek philosophy called euhemerism, in which there's this idea that the Olympian gods are actually the souls of kind of great men, heroes that survived after death. And so this is one of the reasons, for instance, on Crete, you can find the tomb of Zeus. Right? It's like, well, wait a second, how can you have the tomb of Zeus and him be this immortal on Olympus? And the answer offered in the ancient world by a certain strand of Stoic philosophy is, well, he was this mortal, but he's a really impressive mortal, and now his departed soul, resides on Olympus. So there's a certain kind of overlap with this story, but the thing that's kind of agreed here is just this idea of a kind of a fragmentation, right? A personal fragment. Now, in Jesus's teaching, and then on into early Christian thought, this idea of fragmentation is something that gets developed, okay? And so it's interesting if you look at some of Jesus's metaphors of judgment in particular. Okay, let me give you one to ponder. Look at Matthew 24, the end of it. So, beginning in verse 45, who then is the faithful and wise or shrewd servant who the Lord puts in charge of his household, who gives them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant who, when the master comes, will find him doing so. Truly I say to you that he'll put him over all of his possessions. If, however, the evil servant, evil slave, says in his heart, my Lord's delaying, and he begins to beat his fellow servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the Lord of that servant will come at a day that he doesn't expect, at an hour that he's not aware of. And now, here's the thing. Okay, let me pause there for 1 second. What's that about so far? This is talking about a kind of a faithfulness and entering into this process of co-working with God that human beings are called to. Okay, that's what's behind that parable description so far, and that you have some that are doing this in appropriate ways, and if one is ready, even at inconvenient times, to collaborate with God, when that occasion occurs for working with God, the experience is, even in an inconvenient moment, a blessedness. Like we find that when we're caught up in what God's doing, there's joy in the midst of it, okay? Even when it happens at inconvenient times, okay? But there's this other possibility. This is what happens when, instead of kind of scanning for and being ready for the thing that God would have us enter into, instead, I think I kind of put him out of mind, and instead I just start living for my own desires, and I start abusing people around me. In other words, I don't take on any kind of moral, spiritual change, okay? What happens then when that occasion comes is this. So here it's an image for judgment, but it's not just a judgment of end time. It's something that's experienced here as well, okay? Notice this. They're metaphors, okay? But you have to ask, what do they mean? What are they referring to, okay? So he'll show up at a day he doesn't expect, a time he doesn't know, and he said he'll cut them in half, or cut them to pieces. It gets translated differently. Cut them in half, and assign them a place with the actors, the hypocrites. Okay, in that place, there's weeping and grinding of teeth. Think about this for a second. This is describing internal fragmentation. Right? It's not an accident that you have cut in half and assigned a place with actors put together here. I want to suggest that these are two ways of describing the same thing going on. Because what is hypocrisy? What do I do when I kind of play act at being something? What I do is I present myself externally as something that I know internally I am not. Right? Hypocrisy in and of itself is this internal splitting. It's an internal fragmentation of the person. Okay? And what's being described here as cut in half and assigned a place with hypocrites is it's describing, as it were, what is the intrinsic result? What happens within a person at that moment where, having kind of refused the moral and spiritual offerings, the transformation, there's this point of just kind of coming apart, a fragmentation, being, as it were, outed, right, as not what one had presented oneself as, right? And the result then, the weeping and grinding of teeth, I think, I don't know about you, but for me, my experience, I don't grind my teeth when I hurt. I grind my teeth when I'm frustrated. When I'm trying to do something and it's not working, that's when right? And so it's describing, as it were, one way you could think of many of Jesus's descriptions, his metaphors of judgment would be something like this. Just try this on, okay? What would it be like for a being that was created for co-working with God, for collaborative activity with God, if that person ultimately rejected this kind of interactive relation with God that enabled him or her to work in the world in this way? What would be left over? What would be the experience of that person? Right? You see, this isn't about God doing mean things to people. This is about, as it were, kind of the makeup of a human person under conditions of ultimately rejecting, right? And what's left is this kind of internal fragmentation. It's interesting, okay, that backdrop, deep assumption, persons can come apart, right? Persons can come apart. Fragmentation's possible, okay? And let me just point out a similar thing. I mean, we're going through this. It's these are kind of high-level assumptions and distinctions, but point out another something. So this is a passage now, move on to Paul, and a passage that people are very, very familiar with. Romans chapter 7 through the end of the chapter. It describes, again, this kind of internal fragmentation, right? But this time in a different direction, okay? And it's something like this. It's possible to experience kind of an ultimate fragmentation, just kind of coming apart, in a way that's part of a collapse. And that's what Jesus is talking about in that passage we were looking at. But there's also this sense in which we become aware of internal fragmentation in the process of its healing. Okay? And that's what's going on in Romans chapter 7, is that you have this arc of transformation beginning in chapter 5, where we come to be reconciled with God, and then in chapter 6, that leads us to kind of take Him on in baptism, and we begin to think of our bodies now as for God rather than for sin, and so forth. And that brings about in chapter 7, in that passage, this state where we suddenly realize this internal conflict. It's something like this. When I was against God, there was this kind of battle between me and God. And once I turned to God, that battle that was once between me and God, kind of breaks out inside of me. Right? And the experience that Paul describes there is of one's mind coming over to God. Like I begin to see His teaching, and inside I say, I think this is right, and this is good, and this is what I want to be. And in fact, I'm going to do this. But then there's this other element that's in, he calls it my members, my body parts, right? And you could think of this as habit. And the thing is that your body doesn't have to ask your mind permission for everything that it does, okay? And so you get these moments as part of this kind of transformation process where I realize that my body's doing things that I decided not to do, okay? And he analyzes that internal fragmentation there that's in the process of healing now as being unintentional sin. Okay, and that leads to chapter 8 and some resolutions to that. So chapter 7 is not the end of the story, right? But it's an important stage. And again, in the backdrop, you have this picture of persons as complex enough to come apart and also to go through a process of coming back together. Okay? One more stage, and then we'll kind of open this up. And okay. So specifically with regard to demons, right? You see a development in the Desert Fathers. And I'm thinking now of, Evagrius of Pontus and John Cassian and some of these. But what you get is a picture like this. All the demons are specialists, okay? They're all specialists when you read this literature of the Desert Fathers. Meaning what they do is they specialize in a particular moral, spiritual distortion, one or another, right? So there's the demon of lust, and the demon of pride, and the demon of gluttony, and the demon of vanity, and of anger, and deceit, and so forth, right? And what they're treated, when you kind of look at this, they're treated as disconnected bits of personal life that have a kind of existence of their own that drives towards destruction, right? They exist on their own, but it's a destructive existence, right? And they're so disintegrated kind of by their nature that you get this strategy in the Church Fathers that's really interesting, where you can play one demon against the other. You can outsmart them, right? And so in the Desert Fathers, if a person, as he grows spiritually, begins to find himself beset by pride and can't overcome that in just kind of, a straightforward, humble way, one might entertain lust, because that would then shame the person and overcome the spirit of the demon of pride, right? So you can play the demon of lust off against the demon of pride and get them to fight each other, right? So you get this kind of strange thing going on, but what's behind that is this sense of they're like personal fragments. Like the demons, they're not whole persons. They're like bits of something personal that has this way of trying to take over and like run everything on its own, right? Okay. Now let me just kind of point out something that's similar between this, and we'll come right up to our own day to something that's observed by certain strands of kind of psychological theory, okay? Internal family system stuff. But it's interesting, there's something similar here. Some of these theories, they view addictions as something like independent subpersonalities, right? That have this way of operating without coordinating or integrating with the self overall. And so it's as if there's kind of many personalities that are occupying and fighting for dominance within the person. You can see that in things like this, okay? So the heroin addict, for instance. A heroin addict, you will often find doing something like this, where this person will steal from you, even your close friend, your family member. This person will steal in order to get the money to get the fix, okay? And a day or two later, when you are searching for that item or for that money, this same person, in genuine heartfelt compassion, will search for that item with you. Okay? And it's as if you've got two different kind of personalities, and which one do you get today? Right? And it really is like that. It's like you've got a fragment, a subpersonality that seizes control, and that then has this way of kind of shaping life at the moment, right? So let me just kind of suggest that one of the ways, and I won't say it's the only way, right? but that one of the ways that demons work is they come in the language of James, they come in through our own desires, right? They come in through openings that we give, whether that's entertaining too much anger, whether it's, I don't want to kind of admit responsibility, and I entertain a lot of deceit, and that opens. But there's kind of openings, as it were, for these kind of fragmented subpersonalities to be welcomed in to the mind, to the heart. And at that point, they can begin to overtake, right? And there's still a process. There's a process of, as it were, gestation before they bring forth sin, and sin brings forth death in the full measure, right? But there's this kind of process of bringing in, and that what's being brought in is something like this. It's like a fragment of a person that has this way of kind of taking over. And I think that describes a lot of what is of seeing. Now, I'll kind of leave it there for the moment, and let's open it up, and we can kind of questions, comments, and we can kind of hammer on this. So like I said, I didn't promise to be right. I tried to just be as clear as possible. And so if we managed that, now we can kind of hammer it out and maybe get something better, okay? Who has something to... Any thoughts? Yeah.
I wonder if you could tell us more about the physics of the ancient. I wonder if you could tell us more about the physics of the ancient world, in terms of the subtlety of matter, where you have lower realms that have sort of the thickness, coarse matter,
right?
And then you sort of things get subtler, like air itself, and then the heavens. And if that's related, because I've read a lot of interesting accounts about the fall of angels being related to that, they become more coarse, they become demons, and so that allows them to interact. And a lot of medieval people and ancient people, I think, had this sort of conception. So I wonder if you could, if that would be an interesting background for this
Yeah.
discussion as well.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's good. That's interesting.
Yeah, especially in like the Stoic cosmology, right? Where
Yeah, well, actually, what I was going to say is you have more kind of the coarseness and rarefication. It corresponds to levels of tension, is the idea that you get in kind of the Stoic account. So the idea would be something like this. For the Stoics, spirit is something like a kind of, they call it rational fire. They want to think of it as at once material and cognitive. And so there's this, the issue with Stoicism, it is materialist, right? Its ranges of tension are what they describe this as. So spirit, you have degrees of tension, and tension at its highest form becomes cognitive, right? And is in its perfect form inside a fire, which is thought to kind of have tension within itself, because you have this kind of fusion within it of something that wants to go up and something that wants to come down, right? So anyhow, there is this kind of sense in the ancient world often that that kind of thoughts and personal entities can, as it were, be blown in, and you have to be careful if you have openings to your body, right? So this is there in kind of the picture that you get even with the Delphic Oracle of kind of being over this kind of steaming, rising mass that's thought to kind of create a kind of possession, right? And so you definitely get that. Now I think, and this is where I want to step out of it, right? This is where I want to step out of it, because I don't think that you have to have a particular, as it were, physical entry point for a spirit, right? I think spiritual entities, it goes back to this stuff, and we talked about it just a little bit last week, of this kind of, how does information integrate with kind of bodies in this world, right? And it's not the same thing. Like even today, like information and DNA are different, right? The DNA is something like the keyboard that encodes, but it can't hold all of the information. And so there's something beyond it, right? And so I think that's why this picture in James is important, of kind of moving away from, something like it's a physical invasion that brings demons in. And instead, it has to do with kind of desires and thoughts and where our attention goes. So let me offer this as a contrast. If you're thinking in this kind of materialist way, even a Stoic account, there has to be a particular point of entry, because matter occupies something by filling up a space, right? So you have a certain amount of water in there, and it fills this container by filling it, occupying that space. But your spirit, let me suggest, your spirit does not occupy your body in the same way that the water occupies the cup. Okay? How does a spirit occupy? How is it present or absent? A spirit is present through attention, or absent through a kind of a withdrawal of attention, right? And I think you know that at some level, because you've had the experience of being in a conversation with somebody where you realize they're not there anymore, right? And that hurts in a way if it's somebody that matters, and all of that, right? The conversation, and so that that presence and absence has to do with attention at some level, right? And what I want to suggest is that the particular thoughts and judgments and all of that, these are kind of particular forms of attention, right? By which we welcome things into our lives that then take shape and lead to destruction or lead to something better. I don't know if that...
Oh yeah, I never made that connection with tension in the Stoic psychology. It's very interesting. And then
Yeah.
it's a nice little play with the tension. Right?
Tension and attention. Yeah.
Just one last thing I'll say is in the life of Anthony, which I've been reading recently, is Anthony started making fun of the devil at one point. The devil is like coming in apparitions, like imitating women to like, make him fornicate, right?
Right.
And he's sort of like, oh, like the devil is so low. Like he used to be an angel.
Right.
And now I'm like an angel, and you're like, you're lower than my like lowly human nature. And so it's interesting how like there's this sort of fall that's like it's kind of like the devil's like should be mocked for.
Yeah.
And so, but it's almost like the level, like falling to the level of the body when it shouldn't. So just kind of interesting this idea of fall, quite literally,
Yeah. Well, but isn't there something like a reversal or a flip there where the irony is that you can have a being that's utterly spiritual in terms of like he doesn't have a body, right? And yet by dint of where that one's thoughts go, the one that is, as it were, structurally highest becomes the lowest. And then you have these critters with bodies that, we've got to feed and tend to and all of that, that by what we do with our attention then can become, even precisely because of the difficulties of the body through which we do that, they can become the highest thing. Right? And so this kind of...
At one point, Anthony says, I'm kind of embarrassed to eat, like, because I'm used to eating, like, manna in heaven. And so he's just kind of a little... It's just kind of like, it's kind of sad. I need to eat something, So sometimes he's a little bit embarrassed by it. But I think it's all about this play between, like, there's sort of a reverse there. It's like the angelification of humans and like the... Like the coarsification, I don't know what the word is, like the thickening almost.
Yeah.
But anyways, it's enough.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah. Who else?
Well, I have a question. How similar do you think the idea of fragmentation of personhood is in some of the Greek philosophy? Like, is there that concept of daimonia being fragments also of a higher personhood?
Yeah, well, what you do have, so for instance, in Plato, there's a sense that the soul has potentially conflicting impulses within it, right? And so reason and appetite and kind of this competitive element don't automatically cohere, and they can get in each other's way, and so and that leads to a person to live in a way that's not just, that's not righteous, right? When those parts are internally incoherent, and I think, this is. It depends on the particular reading that you have of Plato, but that his account of immortality of the soul is really one of just the rational part or mind becoming immortal, right? I don't think he has an account ultimately of the lesser elements becoming such, and so. So anyhow, yes, you've got there's something shared there, this sense of kind of internal tension and all of that. Another thing that you get that is in the Stoics, there's a strong sense of this kind of internal struggle and conflict. And actually, the language that they use for it, Paul picks up. They refer to it as weakness. So in the same way that the body, when it lacks enough tension to be robust, it trembles, right? So in asthenia, in weakness, sickness, right? There's this trembling. In the same way, the mind, when it can't hold a belief stably, it has this way of kind of wavering, and it wants to do this one moment, it wants to do something else the next, right? And there's that kind of internal trembling that it describes as weakness. I don't think it's an accident that Paul then uses that language in Romans 8, right? So right after describing this kind of internal conflict in Romans 7, then when you get to Romans 8, the Spirit, it prays for us, right? When we don't have words or in our weakness, right? And so there's this kind of intervention of the Spirit of God that's part of that picture of bringing things back together. So I don't know if that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was made me think that it really, the description of fragmentation of persons as demons, really, in the sense, it kind of just, people cease being image bearers. It seems like that kind of ties into a larger biblical narrative. It seems like you see somewhat like, I was thinking someone, I think C.S. Lewis and N.T. Wright maybe thinking about, hell being just as a dehumanization of people. Kind of this inability to be a holistic image bearer.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, you get something like that in, for instance, The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis, where you have this picture of people who are brought up to visit, from purgatory up. And when they first get to heaven, everything's too kind of substantial for them, and it kind of hurts their feet to walk and so forth. But you see, like, there's different things that have taken each of them over. And among them, you have like the grumbler and you have all these different people. And it's interesting, at a certain point, they begin to kind of vanish, right? And there's this kind of question asked in that is, well, is it so bad for this, for an old grumbler, to be this? And the response in that story is, well, that's really the question. Is she an old grumbler, or has she become just a grumble? Right? Well, it's kind of a way of kind of picking up the same picture, playing off of it. Now, let's just say this. My sense is that kind of a biblical picture is that the demon can oppress and can possess and can harass in different ways, but it doesn't negate the actual image of of God within us. So it detracts from our capacity to kind of function with it and so forth. But that's still there. But yes, but it does mar it in very, very real ways. Yeah. And if it were to kind of go all the way to full fragmentation, it would be that would be what would be lost, I think. I think you're right. Yeah. So, anyhow. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. How do you know if you're possessed by demons, and how do you exorcise them?
Yeah. Wow. That's a great question. So there's two things that you see happening in Scripture. The big thing is that you find yourself doing things you don't want, and not just like residual habit or something like that, but actually loss of control. And so like full-on loss of control. It's interesting, this account, there from Enoch is very much the sort of thing that you see in the Gospels also, right? Kind of compulsive violence, attacking, wrestling, hurling to the earth, illnesses, and so forth. All of these are things that you see going on in kind of the Gospel accounts. So that's one piece. And then how are they exercised? It's in the name of Jesus. It's in the name of Jesus. It turns out that invoking Jesus' name actually is something that, if it's done with understanding, is something they can't stand. Now, you get accounts in Scripture of people kind of trying it without having any real connection to Jesus, and let's just say it doesn't turn out well for him. So kingdoms are structures of authority that operate by words, and the kingdom of God is as well, right? And so what's been given is that Christ has the capacity to say come, and things come, and go, and things go, and he does pass that on to his people with regard to resisting these evil entities. So all this to say, yeah. So I don't know if was that.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But do you think that the demons would be, like, for instance, sorry. Is that a question? Like, for instance, a demon in the New Testament account, for instance, would you think there'd be a case for that demon being a fragment of a person?
Yeah.
In that.
Well, in this sense, like, so here's the thing. I think there's maybe more than one way this can happen. Like, I think maybe it could be a fragment of one's own self that breaks off, but I think there's ones that come in from the outside, if I can put it that way. That's the picture that you get in Scripture. And part of what kind of fits with this Enochic picture of fragments left over, so to speak, is it the demons really seem to crave bodies. So much so that, like, for instance, in the whole account with the Legion, it's what? Matthew 8, Mark 3, Luke 8. They're like, well, at least let us go into the pigs, right? Like, in a pinch, swine will do. And so there's something there of they really, like, they can't function in the world without a body, but they don't have their own, right? And so there's something there in that picture. And so I think things come from outside, and kind of an interesting thing nowadays. Like, how do you, if you think about kind of a person like this, a personal fragment as being something that has this kind of a complex of thought and feeling enough to kind of take on a life of its own, those may also be able to kind of reproduce and pass on in all of the kind of the artifacts that we're like pumping into this. So I'm now thinking of things like what happens with AI and stuff like that. You have all these kind of like personal things going on in there. And I don't know why there's any particular reason why they couldn't kind of manifest out of that as much as they manifest in a kind of a fractured mind, in a fractured life here, right? And so, like, it could be that part of what our minds are for are part of rationality is deciding what we let in and what we don't, right? There's a gatekeeping of sorts, right? That has to do with thinking well and kind of, how we kind of orient ourselves to the world vis-a-vis thought. And what all goes into that, I think, may be somewhat mysterious, but you can kind of tell when you've let something in that you shouldn't, right? Like, even if it's not like full on enough to take on a life of its own, we've I think all had experience of watching something, and then like, the nightmare or whatever, right? Of stuff that kind of that works in there, right? And
you lose peace.
Huh?
You lose peace.
You lose peace. Yeah. And so, I mean, at some level, I think, all of these are maybe degrees of a similar process by which we bring in personal realities, or we discern that we should not. right? And then once they're in, how you negotiate them is going to be a different thing, right? And some of them, I think they're so stark and so powerful on their own, we can't just maybe wrestle them down ourselves. You call on the name of Christ, that's it,
Well, the
Yeah.
name Legion is
Yeah.
interesting in that because it's one, you're talking to one.
Because we're many,
You're
right?
really talking to many,
Right.
right?
Yeah, that's right. So the whole notion of fragmentation, kind of the extremity of fragmentation in that case, right, is kind of on the surface. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, please.
Kind of going along with the concept of, I think I'm hearing a bit, but I don't know if you want to go into, like, can Christians be demon possessed? Or what does that look like as a believer versus not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I'll just put it this way. I think that it's still possible if one welcomes in, for that to do everything it would anyways. Okay.
Maybe accidental?
So I think there's a sense in which I think there's a sense in which almost all our wrongdoing is at least partially done in ignorance. I mean, this is Jesus' words from the cross, looking down, right? Father, forgive them. Why? They don't know what they're doing, right? And I would just suggest that that's kind of true of humanity generally in our wrongdoing, is that we don't have a broad enough we don't get everything we're doing with that. And so, yeah, I think we can bring things in that we don't realize what we're doing. And we kind of talked about this a little bit last week. It may be that we cross lines before we know we've done it, but that's also part of why, repentance and so forth is it's part of the great kind of innovation that you have in the Bible in terms of human thought, is that God can bring us back from the brink. So, yeah. So, yes, I think that Christians as well can entertain things that then have ways of taking over if they're not vigilant and attentive. So, yeah.
And what about the thought is that a lot of what's,
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't know how to put it, psychology or depression or schizophrenia or all those, I always sometimes think they're very tied. What would you think of that?
Yeah. So I don't think they're exactly the same thing, but they may be on a continuum in a sense with some of this, right? And, I think it's clear that sometimes you have structural damages and so forth that can have the result of breaking down that kind of that gatekeeping filtration system. And so it could then manifest things that would be very much like this or be this, in some way. But there could be kind of levels of reasons for that. Yeah. But I don't think, so I wouldn't, how do you put this? I think there's a tendency in certain groups to somebody's depressed or blue and it's corner them and try to, pray to exercise or something like that. And I think that's, not helpful or appropriate. But I do think that this is an element of what happens in the world, and there's no. It's possible. It's possible to overemphasize it and become a cyclops, where the only thing you see are spiritual oppressions, and it's also possible to be a cyclops where all you see are kind of the physical ailments, and God gives us two eyes on purpose, So, yeah.
What about
what about spirits existing without bodies, or I'm thinking particularly of like, is it called zeitgeist? Like the spirit of the age, or kind of evil that runs in some ideologies or in, you know, yeah, I don't know. Can you speak something to that and how that affects us and maybe doesn't possess us, but is that the filtration system? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that could be a part.
Doesn't exist, right? I guess I want confirmation that that's. Sorry, I think you kind of. Let me say this. I think you kind of answered my question when you were talking. I had a question earlier about, you're talking about like the stuff out of Enoch, and you had a particular number there of the spirits that came down.
Yeah, there were 200 in ranks
Right.
of 10. So you've got 20 chiefs over the 200 and all of this. And they have particular names and all of that. In the we've got copies of it. Anybody can pull it down and read it if you want to. So
that sounded very finite. So I was going to ask you what. So we've got like 200 demons running around, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
But then it sounded like you were saying, if I'm correct,
it was the children born to them, the giants, that then become the demons.
And then they die, and it's what's left over.
But the demons, so the demons are just one among a number of different kind of spiritual entities, right? And they're, as it were, the lowest. So these kind of fragments, that's not the only thing there is. But here, so here's my general sense, is that if you think about it this way. We already know within our range of normal experience that there's kind of levels of personal thought and activation and so forth. From like, as you go down from us in lower critters, there's still cognition. Okay? So it's very clear that our cat is planning our demise, right? It wants to harm, right? And we have a dog that's, rather friendly and so forth, right? You go down and you find that there's something going on. We don't know everything. We don't know what it's like to be them, but it's something lower, simpler in some way, right? And what you could say is like going up, there's no particular reason that cognition would only be at our level, right? Why wouldn't there be kind of collective things like that? And it's interesting, through the ages, one of the ways that this is expressed is, so for instance, you have, and we'll come to this later, kind of the spirits of the nations and so forth is a theme that you have in Scripture, okay? And it's interesting that it's put at this level, like part of what we've been chasing out kind of in this is that if you have a series of Genesis 1 through 11 of accounts in which it's all supposed to depict something about all of us, that the earlier, what I'm playing out is kind of the deeper bit, and the more surface comes in the later stories, right? So as you kind of layer this up, when you get to the end of this section, like 10 and 11, you start dealing with nationhood. Which is interesting because it's a part of every human life, right? Every human life, there's some kind of identity that comes from cultural, orientation and all of that. And so that's important, but it's not as deep as these kind of most structural things of kind of agency and that, differentiating into protection, production, communication, things like that, right? So as you go up, now, what's interesting when you get to that level of talking about the division of the nations in Genesis 10 and 11, you get this kind of backdrop account of the division of the nations in like Deuteronomy 32. And what happens there is that the Lord, when He separates out the nations, He does it according to the number of the sons of God. So there's some kind of assignment of different cultural groupings to different spiritual entities. And one way you could think about that is that every culture is its own spiritual experiment at some level, right? And those can live in varying degrees of kind of subjection and integration with God and what God's doing, or in opposition to Him, right? And so one of the accounts that you get, so there's this sense of this kind of spiritual backdrop of kind of the production of different cultures. Then you have this kind of added account of what's happening, under Christ, is that the principalities and powers, and so all these kind of, as it were, the spirits of the nations are being brought into line, into rank again under Christ. That essentially, and they're not being done away with; they're being deactivated. Is the actual term.
They're not bringing. They're not being brought in submission to God.
That's one of the terms used is kind of fall into rank. So ipotasso is kind of military, to fall into rank under, right? So, or you can translate subjection. But then there's also this kind of deactivation. In other words, it's kind of like it's literally the word to unemploy. You can deactivate something. You don't have to destroy it. You can just say you don't have that function anymore, right? And so it's something like that. It's like you still have these kind of spiritual entities that have to do with the shape of a culture, and part of what is to happen is those are to kind of come under Christ, and that lines things up in some way. So I mean, it's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but yes, that's great. Thank you. But I wanted all of that too. But I'm trying to tie it back also to like our everyday experience. And I was getting at, so like what, there's like 400 demons running around, but then you also said later, fragments of us. I mean, so I'm trying to get a better sense of the demon world as we experience it today.
Right, okay.
Like what, where do demons come from? Are they all these ancient things? Are they pieces of humanity floating through the air?
Okay. Demons, very particular, are these fragments of persons. That's just one string of spiritual entity. It's not all demons, right? But you do have this sense of principalities, powers, things like that, which I take to be something more like the overall direction, the particular way of cohering in kind of in a culture or people group. And that those are viewed as having kind of conflicts going on between them. And if you bring that down to our own experience, we very certainly see that. Because we can embody different ones, and it's very common, especially, think about it this way. We've had the experience of culture shock and kind of like the worldview confusion of kind of moving between different people groups and so forth. What is that? At some level, that corresponds to, I'm trying to inhabit a kind of a spiritual cultural orientation of more than one people, more than one group, that doesn't cohere easily, right? There's some element of that, and within particular cultures, then you often get kind of multiple kind of wings of kind of angles of vision, where one thing becomes kind of the big issue. It's all about compassion, or it's all about law and order, or something like that, right? And those have ways of kind of breaking off, and those fragments then of thought systems operate kind of semi-autonomously and come into conflict with each other. You see that at these higher levels also, right? And so I think, yes, we live in the midst of those sorts of tensions. I mean, it seems to me like a fairly self-evident experience that we have. We're not used to talking about it as a spiritual thing, but it is about kind of the relative capacity to cohere or not of this kind of realm of information, ideas, and motive forces that are not embodied. They're not strictly embodied, right? And we live with those all the time. I mean, that's, yeah. I don't know if that is satisfying any mean.
I'll talk to you later.
You'll come at me later, yes. So, yes. I'm sure you will. That'll be good. So, anybody else? Okay. Yeah, please. Yeah.
I might find it fascinating, but also maybe I'm missing stuff because I'm just here now, is who's Satan? Is this way after, obviously, Satan? Like, how would you describe Satan in this context? Or maybe you've already told everybody and I'm completely just
No,
missed it and
actually, we
I'll
haven't talked
ask
about
later.
Satan at all. Yeah. Okay. Well, there's kind of two accounts there. The first is that the earliest thing that you get, like, show up in Job, and he's a particular one in this divine court. And he's something like the prosecuting attorney.
Of the 200 that came down or not related?
No, he's not in there. He's not in that account. But then as you get on into Scripture, he's kind of identified with the one kind of driving all the different forms of rebellion, right? And that tends to then become how we think about him, as kind of the highest among them all, and the one that's ultimately must be defeated. Now, having said that, there's nothing in Scripture that makes him anything like a kind of an equal opposite to God or anything like that.
Angel that fell,
Yeah.
not necessarily.
Well, yeah. I mean, you have Satan falling from heaven. You have that in the New Testament for sure, and then both in the Gospels and then later in Scripture. But no, what I mean by that is it's not like you don't have a sort of though he's, as it were, the highest of these ones in rebellion, he's so far beneath God, there's no kind of, viable comparison between him and God. So he's created, he's limited, he can act in hostility and in rebellion, but only because God allows it up to whatever level or point. So, yeah. So,
Just one of many then.
yeah, one of many, but seems to be the most dominant, something like that. But I don't think. Here's the thing: I don't think that the biblical picture of evil beings like spirits is as structurally coherent. Yeah, like I don't think it's like you've got this one guy and all of them are taking orders all the way down. I think it's actually more like you get more and more fragmentation.
Revelations when they're going to be, him and his are going to be thrown into the...
Yeah. Maybe they all come together in the end, not right? Yeah. Maybe the one thing they get to all do together will be that, But I think that there's both in Scripture and then in this kind of early Christian, like patristic, this sense that there can be a lot of conflict between them as well. It's not like they're all kind of in lockstep to operate against us. So, yeah. Yes, Tim.
What would be some principalities that you've observed in the nation of Greece?
Wow.
From the book of Daniel.
Yeah, I don't even know how to answer that.
Exactly. That's why I asked it.
Timo's like, how to stump Daniel. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, part of what's interesting to notice here is just the you have this. You have kind of elements that absolutely love everything about kind of ancient Greek identity, and it's the deepest thing, and then you have elements that seem to actually really deeply detest that, and see it as what held them back from being alive and excelling now. And so I don't know, there's a number of kind of tension points that I'm noticing without understanding everything that's going on there. So I'm very much a kind of an early learner in this culture. So yeah. But yeah, just kind of noticing some of those kind of tension points has been interesting for me. You tell me, what have you seen? I would love to hear.
I'll tell you off camera.
Off camera. Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts? Okay.
You know, on the issue of Greece versus other places, it's interesting how I forget the name of the scholar that was saying this, but we kind of are seeing with technology the erosion of cultures, so that anywhere you go in the world, it
starts to look the same.
It's pretty much the same.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certainly distinctions, but that presents a whole other world of fragmentation also, because we're the same in technology, but yet when individuals use technology, we become very fragmented. You know, we're one thing online, we're another thing here, we're another thing there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Very good. All right. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I promised it would be weird, and
Yeah, very nice.
thanks, guys.
Thank you.